Okay, I have started the recording and just give me a minute to begin my presentation. Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second Material Reuse Deep Dive Forum, Impact of Building Materials Reuse on Climate Change. My name is Mary Ann Remolidor, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Northeast Recycling Council, also known as NERC. NERC is the host of the forum, and I want to thank our sponsor, the Connecticut Department of Energy and the Environment. I wanted to let you know, people are still logging into the forum, but we have quite an audience today with 37 states, DC, Guam, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and Canada. So this is a great opportunity for you all to connect and network with your colleagues across many areas, many locations. The Northeast Recycling Council is a nonprofit organization. We work with the 11 Northeast states, and we have some national programs as well. We focus on sustainable materials management. So from source reduction, reuse, recycling, organics management, and green purchasing. Over the past 35 years, NERC has built a strong network with states and other government entities, as well as industry. So we bring all the various groups together through, and our board of directors are the environmental agencies from the 11 states, and our advisory members are businesses, trade associations, municipalities, nonprofits, and consultants. NERC has been working with the National Planning Committee for the forums, and here is the list of people who have participated on that planning committee. And I'm sure you recognize one or more of these people because they've all been working in reuse or on reuse topics for many years, and we're delighted to have the opportunity to work with everyone here. And before we begin, I wanted to just provide you with a definition of material reuse. For us, when we are talking about materials reuse, we mean the reuse of durable products. And this is a larger definition for you all. And now I'd like to turn things back to Heather Trim, Executive Director of Zero Waste Washington, who will moderate the forum. Heather.
Good morning, everyone. Most of you, a few of you, I think it might be good afternoon. Really happy that you all are here. This is a very exciting forum that we have today. And as a note to you all, this is a bit of an experiment to do these forums, and so we really welcome your feedback and your ideas for future topics. The idea is that we're trying to get folks from across the North America, I guess you could say, U.S. and North America, to share our sort of knowledge and best practices and to make these forums super useful for you. So today the format is 3 terrific speakers who will each speak for about 15 minutes each, and then we will do a very in-depth Q&A, and we want you all as audience members to really be participating. Turn on your camera and actually ask questions live and make this a really good dialogue for you. So I'm super pleased to introduce our first speaker. It's Sarah Edwards, who is CEO of Eunomia. And Sarah and all the speakers will do a more in-depth introduction of themselves and their bio as they get started with their presentations. And if you all can keep muted and your videos off and let it be focused on Sarah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Heather, and thank you everyone for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. I think it's going to be a great conversation and just so much to cover. So just let me know. Hopefully I am showing my presenter
Right now you
screen.
have both. Yeah, there you go. Now you're perfect.
Perfect. Okay, brilliant. So yes, as Heather said, I am Sarah Edwards. I'm the CEO of Eunomia Research and Consulting in North America. I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to who we are, as many of you may not have heard of us. But despite my English accent, I am based in New York City. So we're effectively an international environmental consultancy that really does focus around the circularity and progressing climate-based goals with consideration for the resources that we're using. So we pride ourselves on effectively using a very evidence-based, data-driven approach to finding solutions for our clients, and that whether that be within the NGO, private or public sectors. This slide just gives you a little introduction to our reach. I suppose we are headquartered in the UK and have a number of offices there, but also have presence outside in both wider Europe as well as New Zealand. And as a consultancy, as a fairly niche consultancy, really focusing on the circular economy, we have about 140 people. So really deep-seated knowledge around how we transition from the linear economy to a circular one, where we are really respecting the resources within our environment. So I thought my place really is what I'm going to focus on is just giving you a little bit of introduction of why we need to look at reuse of the construction sector now, and then just give you an overview of some of the work that we've actually carried out in Europe, and introduce you to a project that we're looking to get off the ground here in North America to really demonstrate the need for reuse in this sector. So just some kind of high level facts that many of you on this call might already be aware of. You know, the construction sector contributed effectively to 1.61 trillion to the US GDP in 2018. So it's a major contributor to the economy. But as a result of that, more than 600 million tons of construction and demolition waste were generated and disposed. And this is, we often talk about municipal waste and household and commercial waste, but this quantity is twice as much as what we see across both the residential and the commercial sector put together. So there's a significant amount of work that we need to do to reduce that amount of waste that's generated. On top of that, we know globally that the built environment as a whole accounts for 39% of our global carbon emissions. And in the industries within that sector, so we're thinking about the steel industry, the aluminium industry, the concrete industry, are effectively responsible for 10% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And construction materials account for about half of our raw materials. So, the focus of this webinar is very much around construction and its impact on climate change. These figures basically tell us all we need to know. Reducing the embodied carbon impacts from the construction industry is vital in terms of both reducing our resource material sourcing within the manufacturing process, how we use those materials wisely within the design, construction and use of a facility, and most of all, how we minimize that disposal and keep material back in circulation. These things are all critical if we're going to limit our greenhouse gas emissions and global warming by 1.5 degrees centigrade by 2030. And as we all know, this is probably becoming increasingly more difficult, which is why we need to really focus on this sector, which has for a long time, I think, been fairly forgotten. So I'm now going to just talk through a few pieces of work that we've completed. So this first piece of work is actually a brand new report that my colleagues have done, looking at the importance of really reducing new material production and input impacts. So how we can reduce the use of new materials, so the extractive and productive measures within the construction industry, and why it's so important that we actually look at this in addition to other reuse factors. So basically, industries contributing greatest to greenhouse gas emissions includes the aluminium, concrete, steel and plastics industries, all very much used in construction projects. And as part of this piece of work, we effectively, for those four largest contributing industries, we took a deep dive into their net zero plans. And actually only two of those industries, the concrete and the aluminium industry, had a complete 2050 net zero plan. So we analysed what was in those plans and effectively what did we find. There's some effectively, we found those plans were not going to be sufficient to meeting to addressing the impacts of the construction industry in terms of its greenhouse gas emissions. So some of the industry actions that would be needed to enable that the industry to address those carbon emissions would be for the aluminium industry to basically rapidly adopt some of the existing technologies. So for that industry, effectively, there are known solutions. They are proven at scale, and they basically just need to rapidly adopt those to enable that industry to decarbonize effectively. The picture is very different if we look at concrete and steel. So both of those industries really are reliant on emerging industry technologies such as carbon capture, utilization and storage, and the use of hydrogen in helping them reduce in sufficient quantities their greenhouse gas emissions and obviously their impact on climate change. So both of those sectors have an uphill battle that's going to be, it needs to be accelerated effectively. This diagram here is a result of some of the modelling that we effectively did as part of this study. So you can see that there's different bars for different industries. So you can see the pink bar there is the amount of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions over time that industry is predicted to produce. The green bar is the concrete and cement industry. The yellow strand is iron and steel, and the orange one plastic. So on top of that, you have a number of different dotted lines. So on the top line is effectively what we call the business as usual line. So this is basically if these industries did nothing, just continue to grow and didn't put in place mechanisms to address their greenhouse gas impacts. So you can see the huge kind of input growth there. Then we can see basically the orange line is what would be needed to effectively enable them to reach that less than 1.5% global greenhouse gas emissions global warming factor. So there's a significant delta in terms of where those industries need to get to and where we're on track with even with the current measures for meeting. So there's a huge overshoot there in terms of mapping what they've said that they could do with really what we need to achieve. So what is some of the things that can put in place? Well, obviously, some of these things we probably talk about today, but really there needs to be more policy interventions that help reduce material consumption and obviously drive the shift in material use to less carbon intensive sectors. Circularity, high recycling rates, increase in reuse needs to go alongside this reduction in material consumption. And even looking at things like switching materials is obviously going to be critical. So timber to replace concrete, plastics replaced by paper, for instance. So any resource policy needs to be integrated in our minds with policy on waste, recycling and product design so that we get a complete circular picture of the measures that are needed to address greenhouse gas emissions and climate change resulting from the built environment. So looking at some of the work that we've done to follow on from that, I suppose, we around about 4 years ago, we effectively started doing some work with the European Commission. And this was really looking at product policy framework. So we talked in that previous slide about the need for some policy measures to support actions in the built environment and the construction sector. So as part of this work for the Commission, we effectively focused on a number of different product areas. So there was one related to energy and appliance and electronics, one related to chemical products. Obviously, what we're here to discuss today is construction projects. So we looked in detail around the actions that might be needed around precast concrete, steel beams, insulation, windows and doors. And a part of that work also was around transport, automotive, textiles and toys. As I said, this work was carried out 5 years ago, and this has actually been fed into some revised regulations on construction product passports. So the opportunities that we identified, which may not be, too unfamiliar to many of you on this call, but for the concrete sector, some of the measures were related to replacing in situ with precast concrete, trying to increase the amount of recycled content in precast concrete, looking at how we could repair and reuse it, and looking at design for reassembly, and obviously increasing overall recycling as materials and products come to the end of their use. around steel beams and frames, very much looking at reuse and redistribution of those, whether that's within the same development or externally, recycling, and then looking at also lightweight design. And then opportunities around the windows and door sector, so looking at increasing recycling of flat glass, design for disassembly and repairability and recyclability, which is obviously very much linked to how we ensure that we maximize reuse in the sector, kind of direct reuse on a product by product basis, and then also looking at alternative sustainable materials, which I touched on previously. And finally, in the installations area, we very much looked at reuse, recycling, use of recycled content, and then additionally alternative sustainable materials, e.g. bio-based. And then finally, I think an area that we very often don't think of as being a measure to increase construction circularity in the construction sector and really driving reuse is what states and governments effectively can do. So as part of this project, we worked for the Scottish Government under Zero Waste Scotland, and we were tasked to identify circular economy opportunities that had high economic value or environmental benefits within the portfolio of built environment projects that came under the remit of the Scottish Government. So very much similar to a state looking at where they need to invest to develop and have constructions within their portfolio. This is about the Scottish Government, what they could effectively control, not what was carried out by the private sector, but what was going to be commissioned through the Scottish Government. So we were tasked with effectively identifying materials and products with the highest circular economy potential, identifying opportunities in specific subsectors, so obviously where they were looking at developing housing, commercial premises, educational areas such as schools, and then looking to match the ambition to resources and timescales. So, what could be possible with the resources within the departments and within the timescales that they had available to them, and of course identifying the barriers and how they could be addressed. So the focus was very much first on developing a list of construction, refurbishment and demolition projects, reviewing these against a number of different criteria to understand which one are likely to have high impact and circular economy opportunities, and then taking a much deep dive into a shortlisted number of opportunities. And then from that, basically the analysis used a hierarchy of actions to assess and to evaluate the resource efficiency. So we looked very much around kind of key areas around the design and material choice, the sourcing, so whether we could incorporate recycled content or whether there's the opportunity to look at refurbish, for instance. We looked at where there could be lower use impacts in terms of some of the materials used in terms of the energy usage, and we obviously looked at disposal options, so whether there's the ability to take back or reuse items. And these were effectively the 8 opportunity areas that came out. So these were the recommendations that went back to the Scottish Government to incorporate effectively into their procurement processes and into their design processes. So really focusing very much where they could on modular design, so including design for deconstruction and material passports, looking to transition away from concrete to circular timber in construction, using circular aggregates, including concrete, brick, soils and stones, looking at structural steel and aluminium reuse, and then looking at closed loop and lean design and construction for plasterboard or there. And then making retrofit and refurbishment, including repair and maintenance for more circular designs, and effectively looking at large infrastructure and regenerative projects. So circular scoping studies at the front end of the process, and the material banks and reuse hubs at the back end of the process. And then obviously really important is looking at how you improve the utilization of usage of the building, which is really important, I suppose, at the moment when we're going through a transition from coming out of COVID into more kind of utilized workspaces.
Hey, Sarah, 3 minutes.
Okay, brilliant. don't know what happened here, so I'll just put it here. Just in terms of some of the circular procurement opportunities. So this again was done with the Welsh Government, and this was really what we have produced here, and I really do recommend that you have a look at this because it's a very interactive guide, but it's basically advises procuring authorities, so things like states and municipalities, on how to prepare for circular and low embodied carbon procurement. So that's everything through the design, construction and engineering process. And it also advises contractors on how to evaluate supply chain partners when responding to these requirements. So really looking at the whole supply chain and how you can embed circular economy principles and procurements through that supply chain. And the document provides actually some very specific clauses that you can use, cut and paste, and place into contracts that you might be developing. Here on the left-hand side, we just have the sustainable procurement hierarchy, so very much similar to the waste hierarchy, but looking to kind of predominantly look at reducing. So that's rethinking and redeploying, sharing, repairing as you build up the design process, you know, through to kind of recovering as much as you can at the end of the process. Just to give you insight into what this circular procurement guidelines does, so you can see here it really does, it is very, very user friendly. It looks at different stages of the construction and use of a building, so from first of all from the strategic direction through to handover and use, and it provides some very clear actions for both the client, the organization procuring the construction or designing the construction, through to the contractor that might be carrying out some of the work, and give you some clear guidance on what you might need to include both in the contract and how you might want to manage that relationship. And this one, another really interesting, useful slide, is looking at kind of again against those key phases of a project, who should be responsible for setting circular economy and reuse requirements within the stages of the project. So everything from who sets the strategic direction, who's responsible for the design and what you need to incorporate as part of that design process, through to the use, and who's responsible for managing and optimizing circular economy opportunities in that use phase as well. So just a little bit on what next for us, I suppose. This is a bit of a call out. We have been looking at trying to transfer some of our knowledge, I suppose, on circular economy in the built environment over to the US. So we have been talking for a while with kind of Build Reuse, and we are actively looking for funders at the moment to kind of help us do a real baseline assessment, really, of where we are in the US in terms of quantifying the current economic and social environmental benefits of reuse in the construction sector, and forecasting out effectively what this could look like going forward with a range of both policy and investment measures. So we know that there's a huge potential in this sector to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and help us keep under that 1.5% global warming. And what we would really like to do is set the scene with a report that just quantifies that and provides some analysis of what the missed opportunities are, but also sets a policy and investment recommendations. So that's all from me. I think in the presentation that you'll receive, there are a number of different reports that you could link to that we've done. And just one point is that we have just finished a really great piece of work with Reuse Minnesota, measuring statewide impacts of reuse there. So that report and the tool that we developed will be out soon. So with that, I'll hand it back.
Great, wonderful. Sarah, that was terrific. I have 1,000 questions I developed. So for those of you who didn't hear, came in a little bit late, if you could rename yourself with your affiliation under the participant, click on participants and then click on the videos, little video thing, and you'll get 3 dots and you can rename yourself, because the idea behind this forum is we do want people to be networking and getting to know each other through your Q&A. And we're going to have 2 more presenters, and then we'll have a very robust Q&A. And the Reuse Minnesota topic that Sarah just mentioned will be one of the presentations at our next forum, the first set next year. So I'm really pleased to introduce Heidi Swank with Rethos. And Heidi, take it away, and please go ahead and more thoroughly introduce yourself.
Great, thanks. I'm gonna make sure I get my shared screen up and. Okay, now you're just seeing my
It's perfect right now. Yes, you got it.
Okay, great. All right, so my name is Heidi Swank. I am the executive director at Rethos. We are a historic preservation nonprofit. We are headquartered in St. Paul, Minnesota, but work across the United States with some of our programs. I'm going to be talking today about the role of historic preservation in reuse and stemming climate change. I will be referring both to Minnesota and Nevada, where I worked in Nevada in historic preservation before this. And I want to emphasize in this that I'm going to be talking about Rethos specifically in programs that we do, but we are just one of many historic preservation organizations across the country who are working really to step into that climate change sector and looking at how we can safeguard buildings and reuse buildings. I know there's a lot of earlier generations of historic preservation that really focused on preservation for preservation's sake, where Secretary of Interior's standards was everything or it was demolished. I think that a lot of us have learned during these decades that that's not necessarily the best way to approach our built environment and saving it as a touchstone for our history. So I'm going to be talking a bit about the ways in which historic preservation is really about keeping buildings out of landfills. And one last note that I always forget to say at the beginning of a talk is to keep in mind that as I'm talking about historic buildings, this means 1972 and earlier. So everything that's 50 years old and earlier doesn't have to be 1890s. It can be 1970s also. So at Rethos, we work to support community vitality through enabling the reintention and rehabilitation of old buildings. It's everything from maintaining strict historic integrity to deconstruction, because we know that historic preservation takes many forms. A little bit about us. We are a 12-person nonprofit. We have been around for about 40 years. We have 3 divisions: community programs, real estate, and our policy institute. Today, I'll be mainly talking about our community programs in terms of the deconstruction education work that we've been doing, but I'm also going to delve into our policy institute and a lot of the policy work that we are embarking upon to ensure that we maintain we retain our older buildings. We do, as an organization, also run the Minnesota Main Streets program. That's the affiliate of Main Street America. And we have our historic rehab loans for developers who are using state historic tax credits. We also have continuing education for realtors on home retention and reuse. And of course, also our Policy Institute. So one of the things I like to start off in talking about historic preservation and kind of how we got to where we are today in preservation is that preservation has really historically been about loss. I always say that if you want to get into historic preservation and you are not going to be able to handle losing that amazing building that you're so attached to, this is probably not your field. There are 2 examples here. One is in the upper right. This is the Save the Shave campaign to save the Burma Shave building that was in downtown Minneapolis. And this is one that we lost. It was earlier on in our history when maybe we weren't thinking so much about reuse as we were about just preservation for preservation's sake. Excuse me. In the lower left, we have PV Plaza. So PV Plaza was a park with a very large water feature in downtown Minneapolis that had gotten into a bit of need of repair and some rethinking. And the city of Minneapolis had decided that they were going to demolish it and build on that site. Rethos and several other organizations were part of a coalition that brought a lawsuit against the city of Minneapolis to retain this. And today it was actually one of our big success stories. The coalition received an award from Docomomo for this. And this is now a very vital and important part of downtown Minneapolis life as a great open space. So just thinking about the fact that we know that we lost so much in the years in historic preservation when really we were just about preservation, not about thinking about how can we be more adaptive and more nimble to think about how we can reuse these buildings. So at Rethos, we've had a lot of conversations about what historic preservation is trying to do. If we are not just trying to do preservation for preservation's sake, what is it that the field should be thinking about? And we're not the only organization having these conversations. There are myriad historic preservation organizations across the country having these conversations. So for us, we feel very strongly that part of what we are doing as historic preservationists is protecting our environment. We see that as part of a main aim of what we do as an organization. We also know that we protect buildings and we tell histories. So for us, really, it's not about those three things. It's really about the ways in which they interact. If we are protecting the environment in the way that we should, we'll also be protecting buildings and telling histories. So those two things that have really traditionally been part of historic preservation. If we're protecting buildings, we'll also be able to tell the histories of those buildings and protect the environment by not having them land in the landfills. And for us, I'll just reiterate that protecting buildings could be everything from keeping it exactly the way it was when it was built to deciding that there's no way to retain that building on that site and deconstruct it and reuse those pieces in another building. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of how Rethos got to where it is, because I think we're reflective of the larger historic preservation field for folks who have gotten beyond the old definition of historic preservation. So I think for us, a lot of the things that happened started a little bit before 2011, and I can talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but in 2011, Rethos became a Green Step Cities partner, and we've been very involved in that process ever since. Around the same time, Minnesota also got a state historic tax credit. And I will say that if you are in a state without a state historic tax credit, you should get one. This is one of the most important tools to saving buildings and reusing them and making sure that you are not putting them in a landfill. It allows a good amount of flexibility for reuse. It also just makes that heavier lift of getting buildings reused and repurposed much more affordable for developers. So that all kind of happened right around 2010, 2011. A few years passed, and then in 2014, we hosted our first class of Why Old is Green. And then also at the same time, we dissolved our Sites Worth Saving program, which I'll talk about in a minute. By 2018, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency had kicked off their Sustainable Building Group, and we joined that. And then we really start to get on a role of getting toward this idea of historic preservation as reuse. And I also want to be sure to give a shout out here to Natalie Hennigan, who was our former education manager, and she really put in the foundation for all of this work. So in 2019, 2020, Rethos joined Reuse Minnesota and Build Reuse. In 2021, we taught our first deconstruction class, Bringing Down the House. And then in 2022, we taught our first deconstruction masterclass series, and we've also advocated at the legislature for more expanded issues, not just the tax credit, but other issues too. So just going into this this journey that Rethos went through a bit more, we have a magazine that comes out 3 times a year. In 2008 and 2009, we had 2 different themes. In 2008, we had a sustainability themed magazine, and in 2009, it was a salvage themed magazine. In 2009, we also at the Minnesota AIA convention sponsored the Old is the New Green symposium. And then by 2014, I want to just talk about this a bit because I think there are a lot of historic preservation nonprofits who have kind of come to this realization and are not sure what to do. There's a very common practice that historic preservation nonprofits do, which is put out an annual most endangered list. And we had been doing this as a 40-year-old organization for some time. However, as we kind of went back to look at what happened with the buildings that were put on this list, is often we lost those buildings. And so we had internal conversations here at our organization about how better to support these buildings that we thought were endangered. And so this list kind of changed into a program called Sites Worth Saving that focused on a very small number of buildings every year and worked for several years to try to save them. One of our first is that Carnegie Public Library in the upper left-hand corner. It was one of our first sites worth saving, which is still there. However, by 2014, it became clear that even when we, as a small organization, partnered with other people who cared about these buildings, we did not have a good track record for saving them. And so we just dissolved the entire program and decided not to go forward with that. And I know there are a lot of organizations that still do this, that still put out these lists. But for us, it was really a turning point. And so we had a lot of internal conversations about moving away, again, from the Secretary of Interior's standards, which have a great place in historic preservation, but that covers such a small sector of buildings that need to be reused and not put in a landfill, that we knew we needed to kind of branch out away from that. So by 2015, we had worked to move a small house. You can see that in the lower left-hand corner. This is a house that had been situated right next to an older building that they wanted to make into a brewery. So this building was moved around the corner and put on a new lot and is now a nice home for someone. It's a residence currently, and that allowed the brewery to start to use that space as a beer garden, which is a great place for folks to gather and a nice center of community in downtown St. Paul. So we really started to rethink things, because once you move a building, like, it can't get on the National Register, it can't get tax credits, right? So we were starting to kind of move away from that perspective. And then, of course, I said in 2022, we taught a 3-course deconstruction class that was funded in part by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which was great to hear that they are supporting this type of work. And then we began to legislate outside of our traditional wheelhouse, and we worked at the legislature toward a zero waste grant program that was put forth in the legislature. So some of the things that we have also been working on is a lot of work around preservation policy. We are looking at policies that can work to change to reduce demolition and ensure that buildings stay where they are. For us, so much of the work that historic preservation can do to really contribute to this circular economy is to make sure that the buildings that we have stay in good shape and they stay there. So one of the pieces that we are looking at is advocating for more local historic districts, definitely thoughtfully done. But if you So local historic districts are important because they are the historic districts that actually protect buildings. State and federal register listings have no protections. Those are merely honorary lists. But once you get on a local register, then there are protections. And this is something that I did in my work in Nevada, is that we used local historic districts to protect smaller houses that were affordable housing. And so one of the challenges though here in Minnesota that we've had is that the process for being designated as a local historic district comes basically from your city council person. It's basically them. They get to decide whether or not they support it. How it's done in Nevada is you have to get 51% of the homeowners to support it and to kind of vote to become a historic district. And then that goes to city council from the community itself. And in the work that I did in Nevada, we were able to protect several neighborhoods that butted up against the Las Vegas Strip that had smaller houses in them, and able to protect those smaller houses as affordable housing. I also mentioned the importance of state historic tax credit legislation. I think that this is one of the really great tools, especially for larger projects, but also trying to find a path to getting not just commercial tax credit, but also residential tax credits, and then reducing the amount of investment that has to be made in order to access the tax credits. Right now, it's a pretty high, at least in Minnesota. And so trying to find that way we can leverage that historic tax credit to increase rehabilitation and maintenance of our older buildings, both commercial and residential. Another piece that we're working on is trying to incentivize the redirection of development to vacant parcels. We know that the best planning is one where a developer doesn't get to build something wherever they want, that maybe
Heidi,
there's
yeah,
some
3 minutes
direction.
for you.
Okay, thank you. So one of the things we're working on is a vacancy tax that would be put in place on parcels that are left empty for a longer than a specified period, in order to motivate folks who may be trying to assemble parcels or just hold on to something for a better market, to just encourage those folks who are holding on to vacant parcels to seek development on those and thereby redirect developers. We're also looking at possible tax breaks for developers who will build on existing vacant parcels, thereby incentivizing not targeting a building that's already there, but looking at other spaces. We're also advocating for a thoughtful rent stabilization that does not incentivize demolition. Currently, most rent stabilization will exempt new construction, which then incentivizes demolition. So we're looking at some alternatives to that because we know there are a lot of rent problems at this point in the United States. We're also looking at better demolition reviews. I know a lot of places have demolition review, but there are a lot of places that don't. And looking at a thoughtful process to demolition review that involves outreach to public and outreach to a statewide nonprofit that does historic preservation before that demolition happens. So with that, I want to just emphasize again that Rethos is not alone in this work. There are a large number of historic preservation organizations that are working to avoid demolition, including the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the National Preservation Partners Network. Rethos is part of a growing field of preservation organizations across the country who see historic preservation as an important piece of the demolition problem. And we know that, like, in typical nonprofit fashion, we're not always the best at getting the word out. But until historic preservation can really expand public understanding of our field, we will continue to be thought of as an obstacle to reuse, deconstruction, and fighting climate change. So with that, I will say that if you are with an organization that is not historic preservation, please do reach out to your local historic preservation organization, either local, statewide. Find out what they're doing. Chances are there are partnership opportunities with your folks right near you. If you are with a historic preservation organization who does this work, keep working to get the word out. And if you're with a historic preservation organization who doesn't do this and would like to, please do reach out to me. I am more than happy to talk to you about how we got here. And I think together, as long as we can get the word out there, there's a lot of work that historic preservation is doing to reinforce the circular economy. We just need to get the word out. So thank you so much.
Thank you. That was fascinating. Oh my God. All right, so for those of you in the audience, after our next presenter, we're going to ask you to raise your hand so you can ask your question live. And I am super pleased to introduce our next presenter, who is Gretchen Worth, who is with the Susan Christofferson Center for Community Planning. Take it away.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you to my fellow presenters. My name is Gretchen Worth. I'm the director of the Susan Christofferson Center for Community Planning, and I am based in what is a very rainy Ithaca, New York today. We work across New York State with communities to support their efforts to achieve a more equitable, climate resilient built environment. Today, I'm here to talk to you about one of our programs, which is called CROWD, which stands for Circularity, Reuse, and Zero Waste Development. And CROWD is a collaborative network of multiple partners who came together about 2 years ago to create a more sustainable built environment in New York State. And to us, that means building a circular building and construction economy here, with deconstruction and building material reuse as the cornerstone of that circular economy. We are from a lot of different professions: preservationists, planners, architects, policymakers, salvage and reuse professionals, university faculty, students, all working together to create a circular building economy in New York State. And so at the core of what we're doing, we are trying to raise awareness and support for and resources around this vast stream of building materials that ends up in our landfills and incinerators. And so here in New York State, we have banned plastic bags at supermarkets. So it's a BYO bag situation. There is increasing awareness around the dangers of other single-use plastics like water bottles. And so today, walking around the streets, going to meetings, going to conferences, most people are carrying their own flasks. In the past few years, New York State has put in a lot of effort and resources into the idea of food waste, both at a consumer level, encouraging, educating around composting, but also at an industrial level. So in New York State, we have a big dairy industry, we have a big craft brewing industry. There are food byproducts that come as a result of manufacturing. And at a state level, we are dealing with those byproducts to put them, to come up with ways to recreate them into their best and highest use, as opposed to ground cover or feedstock. We would like the same attention, resources, support, awareness around building materials and the waste stream that it is creating. So Sarah mentioned these statistics. I always think they bear repeating. Building waste, construction and demolition debris, CDD, is the largest waste stream in our country. It's the largest waste stream in the world. It is twice the amount of our municipal solid waste, everything else that we throw away as consumers. In this country, we're creating 600 million tons of it, upwards of that every year. And so as a result of that huge waste stream, it also is the largest component of our landfills. Most of it is coming from demolition, even though it's estimated that 80 to 90% of this building material could be reused if it were deconstructed and properly processed and put back into our markets. There is a lot of asphalt and concrete. There's also significant tonnages of wood, of brick, architectural salvage, other reusable building materials. And in New York State, there is no local government that has adopted a deconstruction ordinance or a building material diversion requirement. And I believe there are few, if any, governments in the Northeast of the country. And if you are on this call and you are from the Northeast and your municipality has one of these ordinances or requirements, please get in touch because we would love to hear from you. So again, as Sarah mentioned, the built environment generates a large amount of our CO2 emissions. And while 2/3 of that come from the building operations, the heating, the cooling, et cetera, another third of it is the embodied carbon. And so what it has taken to create those materials to begin with. So from the extraction of the raw material, the transporting of that to a manufacturing process, the transporting of that from the building site. So even if you have developed in our building the greenest building possible, from day one, there is still embodied carbon in that building, which is why preservationists and architects have a mantra of the greenest building is the one that is already built. So I think everyone here realizes the benefits of a circular economy generally. I wanted to pull out some specifics around a circular construction and building economy. So environmentally, obviously, reducing the waste that we're sending to landfills, to incinerators is an excellent thing. And retaining that embodied carbon instead of sending it away to be landfilled. We're also able to conserve natural resources as a result of that. And deconstruction, processing, reuse of materials from a building site, from a piece of infrastructure is far better for health, public health and safety. It is a far safer way to deal with building materials than even the safest demolition site. Socially and culturally, the case has been made that as we get better at adaptively reusing our existing buildings and infrastructure, as we get better at taking them apart and putting them back together, that can inform and improve our future design and manufacturing processes and products and make those more sustainable. There's also the idea that Heidi's mentioned about when a building or piece of infrastructure has to come down for some reason, being able to retain those materials, to put them back into our markets, back into our neighborhoods, helps us to honor the stories, the history, the craftsmanship, the trade skills that are being lost hourly. And it's also encouraging more sustainable treatment of our neighborhoods. Economically, deconstruction jobs are green jobs. Green jobs are local jobs. They tend to stay local, benefiting the local economy. For those of you who may be DIYers, you know that in the past couple of years, building materials have been scarce and the pricing has been at its all-time high. And yet every day we are throwing away valuable materials like this piece of wood from 1918 that you see up in the corner of the slide. And so instead of throwing them away, reusing those materials back into our marketplace can augment our existing supply and really help to strengthen what is predicted to be continuing vulnerable supply chains in the building industry. So to come back to CROWD and some of the work that we do, we work in 4 main areas. So we, across New York State, do a lot of work with education and community engagement. We do exhibitions. You will see this is an example of an exhibition that we did during the summer in Ithaca, New York. We have published resource guides. We hold a monthly virtual speaker series. And so really working to educate, to inform the general public, as well as our local municipal officials and policymakers. And so around that idea of policy, from the very earliest days of CROWD, we have worked to gather policy and best practices, information, insights, expertise from our colleagues all across the country. Unfortunately, New York State is really behind the curve when it comes to deconstruction and building material reuse and building material diversion from landfills. And so we have leaned heavily on our colleagues working in this area on the West Coast, in the Midwest, in the Mid-Atlantic states. And I think some of you are probably on the call today. And so I just want to say to you, thank you so much for your generosity, for all of the resources that you've shared with us. These conversations have been so valuable to us as we develop policy information to be used at municipal and state levels in New York State. And we could not do this work without our colleagues elsewhere. And we will be calling on you again in the future. I also just want to say that yesterday, there are many CROWD colleagues who attended a New York State Deconstruction Summit in Troy, New York, that was organized by Renee Panetta of the city of Troy, who is also a member of the CROWD Collaborative Network. It brought together 70 to 80 people from different professions, different geographies across New York State to come together and spend the day in small groups, workshopping policies around legislative action. There were 21 different areas, everything from asbestos abatement to salvage targets for municipal and state levels. And it was the most amazing, phenomenal day of energy and effort and engagement, and so much momentum resulted from this deconstruction summit. And so it's these kinds of inclusive, creative events where we are hoping to gather ideas from as many different people as possible, so that when New York does get onto the curve of deconstruction and building material reuse, we're really able to do so in a dynamic, robust way that is inclusive and moving us forward into this circular economy creation. We also work in green workforce creation and development. There are a number of colleagues in CROWD who are well-versed in this area through their own work with their own organizations. And then through our university partners, our students, work that the Christofferson Center does, we spend a lot of time on research, data gathering, and analysis. Despite the extreme size of this waste stream, there is precious little data in New York State and at local levels in the state around this waste stream, around its components. And so we are actively gathering, analyzing, and doing research around this that informs the work in the other areas. We have a website, crowd.org, crowd with a zero for zero waste development. On that website, you can find free guides to download. You can find our partner contacts, more information about them. As I mentioned, we have a monthly speaker series where we're calling on our colleagues from across the US and beyond to share their expertise in deconstruction and reuse and creation of a circular economy. There's conference schedules, exhibitions, events, all sorts of different resources. So please check it out. You can sign up to join our website or join our mailing list so that we can send you more information about events that are coming up. If you are located in New York State and would like to participate in this Crowd Collaborative Network, then please get in touch and let me know that, because we would love to have you. The network started in Central New York, in Ithaca and our county, and has over the past 2 years expanded to reach all parts of the state. And so we have members coming from all over, all different professions, but really wanting to see a circular economy and the benefits of building material reuse happen in a meaningful way in New York State. So this picture is sadly a picture of the aftermath of a demolition of a 4,000 square foot home in Ithaca, New York, built around 1900. You can see lots of wood. And so people in the deconstruction sector, and I'm sure many of you say this as well about the work that you're doing, when you look on this pile of building material, you can acknowledge that it's not waste, it's just wasted. And so with that, I will wrap it up. There's my contact information, both at the Christofferson Center, at Crowd. We would love to hear from you if you are located in New York State or the Northeast and would like to get involved with the work that we're doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gretchen. That was really interesting. Okay, so now we're going to ask folks to raise your hand if you have a question or a comment. And if Kendall is there, Kendall, can you go ahead with your first question that you had in the chat? Awesome question. And then we'll go to Sabrina.
Sure, thanks. Well, it's already been answered, I think, by Melissa, but so maybe she can unmute herself as well. I was asking about how to find the balance between preservation and building performance, particularly as we're moving towards electrification of buildings and the like.
And I can grab that one, Heather.
Yeah, go.
So I would say one of the things that to keep in mind as far as like energy conservation, I know that there's a lot of discussion out there between single pane and double pane windows. And I think I had an architect friend who once said that a window is a hole in the wall, no matter how many panes you have. And so to keep in mind that the difference there is really one R value, right, between single and double pane, and that there's a great, as far as like energy conservation in buildings, there's a great publication the National Trust put out some time ago called Saving Windows, Saving Money, in which they did studies of ways in which to make older homes more energy efficient in 5 different areas in different climates across the United States. This is a great resource. It's really clearly laid out. It has a lot of great visuals to it to really help you make better decisions about how to make your buildings more energy efficient. And I would say windows, replacing them is almost your last choice. It's about a 40-year return on investment and energy savings with windows. I mean, as far as solar, I don't know any local district that says you can't have solar. I think you may need to have some creative placement of your solar panels. A lot of historic districts don't regulate at all where your solar panels go because they want to encourage solar. But also to keep in mind that community solar is a really great option if you are trying to maintain the historic look of your building. And then I would say, as far as electrical and plumbing, these are systems that get replaced often in buildings, right? Any buildings that stay around for a long period of time, 30 to 40 years, these systems are going to need to be updated. But even in updating, I'm sure the obvious answer is that even in updating the electrical system in an older building, it's still a lot less in the landfill than building a new building for that. So I hope, Kendall, that answers your question on those fronts.
It does mostly just on the electricity issue. I really meant electrification, moving away from combustion of oil and natural gas as a heating and cooling system to air source heat pumps and the like, and how to integrate that into old buildings. So is it just a challenge for
yeah, no, I would say that I know several people who have made those kinds of shifts in their older homes or buildings. It doesn't seem to be too much of an obstacle. And I'd be happy to talk about it offline with you too.
And Heidi, can you stick the link, if you can find it, to that cool sounding report in the chat? Okay, Sabrina.
Could I just jump in
Gretchen,
really quickly on the electrification? So Ithaca, New York is I believe the first city in the country that has committed to full electrification of its buildings. And I just want to shout out to my colleagues at CRAV from Historic Ithaca, the local preservation group here in Ithaca and Tompkins County. They are a fundamental, important part of the committee that has come together to identify which buildings in a phased approach will get electrified through heat source pumps and other means, and are very focused on older buildings as an equity issue, but as well as to show that older buildings obviously and absolutely can participate in this electrification move.
Cool. Okay, great. Okay, let's go with Sabrina and then Quest. Oh, we can't hear you very well.
Oh, goodness.
Now we can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. I might be a little echoey. So I have a question for you, Heidi, specifically. In sort of Rethos's work and day-to-day operations, does environmental justice or environmental justice concepts play a part at all? And if so, how?
Sure. I mean, I will say that one of the things that historic preservation has not done well historically is it's been telling the stories of basically rich white guys. And so that is definitely something that we know that there are so many other stories that need to be told. I would say this is a very localized example, but if you know St. Paul, Minnesota at all, there's this amazing street called Summit Avenue, where all the railroad guys built their big mansions and all of that. But yet there are a lot of stories like on Ford Parkway where the worker housing and these amazing mid-20th century duplexes were built. Those are the things that we focus on. We feel like there's a lot of work that's already been done to tell the things that historically historic preservation has done, but it's telling the full history, to use the phrase that the National Trust uses. And so those are the things that we're working on now. I just joined Rethos last year as the executive director. I moved from Las Vegas, where we worked in the historic west side of Las Vegas, which is a former segregation neighborhood. And so that was one of the reasons why I moved here, is to start to do that kind of work here.
And Sabrina, who are you with? And can speakers identify who you're with so we can network? Sabrina, who are you with? Uh-oh, now we can't hear you again.
Can you hear me again?
Yeah, there you go.
About that. My name is Sabrina, and I'm actually a Minnesota Green Corps member, which is a type of AmeriCorps program. And I am currently serving at the University of Minnesota and their waste recovery services.
Great, thank you. Okay, Quest.
Good morning. My name is Quest. I ended up founding a deconstruction company with two other partners out of a demolition company, which I still have. I'm sort of on the other side there. It's a service that's needed, but I'd love to see it go away someday. And now I consult on deconstruction in Washington and the Pacific Northwest. My question is, how do we find the balance between letting the market move towards these types of processes like deconstruction versus incentivizing these processes? This is a general question to anybody who's out there, versus mandating or legislating processes like deconstruction. Where's the balance? And or do we just say we know that this needs to be done, and we encourage our municipalities to mandate these things? Thank you.
Great. And why don't we have all the presenters answer this? And I don't know, Sarah, if you want to go first. Sarah's got her video off. Oh, she might be on a call.
No, sorry, I'm here. I'm just struggling to get my Zoom to work. Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be, any kind of a piecemeal approach is obviously going to take a lot longer. So, policy is obviously going to help drive change quicker, but equally it can be more difficult to get policy in place. So I think, spreading best practice in terms of some of the ordinances that include, requirements for decommissioning and deconstruction is really important. And I think, states can take a bit of a leadership role in terms of when they're actually doing state commissioned work, about ensuring that they incorporate into that work like key principles and contract clauses to ensure that this happens as part of their work. So the most effective mechanism will be to have policy either at a state or local level, but recognizing that is slower. I think, there's organizations that can lead by example.
Great. Okay, cool. Gretchen and then Heidi.
I would say it's a combination of all three of the things you mentioned, Quest. I think that there is organic private industry growth. I think that there is incentives that can come, and it doesn't have to be a big amount. We've seen in places like Portland, Oregon, an incentive for a homeowner of $2,000 to $3,000 often is enough to tip the scale to deconstruct rather than demolish. And then certainly I agree with Sarah, the idea of policy in place or moving toward policy locally is really important. California is the only state in the country with a building waste diversion requirement. And so at the state level, there can be enabling legislation, there can be funding from the state, but it's really the local policies that are going to make the difference. And I think a critical mass in geographic regions where people can start to see that, oh, this works and what the outcomes are and so on. So all three things that you mentioned, trying to make them all happen at the same time is going to get us there faster.
Okay, great. Heidi?
So one thing I'll add is, so when I lived in Nevada, I was a member of the Nevada legislature. I served in the legislature for 4 terms, and I chaired the Natural Resources Commission. One of the things I'm really working to do is get people into elected office. I think that as someone who advocates now, if you are not pushing the button, if you are not the one with the vote, we are then waiting for other people to do that for us. If anyone wants to run for elected office, I don't know much about the federal level, but the state and the local levels, please email me. I will talk you through how to run a campaign. I will help out. I think until we can actually start being the ones who are pushing those buttons for the votes, we're going to have an uphill battle.
That was a great and very different answer than one would have expected. That was terrific. Okay,
Can I add one more thing? Sorry.
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Gretchen.
I also think that the public education and awareness component of this is really, really critical. So we all talked about what a huge, huge waste stream building materials are, but it's an unseen waste stream. And there is so little awareness just around the general public about the quantity that goes into our landfills and that it can be reused. And so I think that education level of the general public is also a really important component.
Terrific. Susan.
Hi, I'm Susan Hines. I'm with the Gypsum Association. We represent the manufacturers of gypsum panel products, and I am the Director of Stewardship and External Affairs. So we've been doing a lot of research around deconstruction and recycling and everything. But I recently learned, talking to somebody in Canada, where deconstruction is much more robust than it is here in the United States. This was in Ontario, I think, Canada, or maybe it was British Columbia. Anyway, be that as it may, I learned that they cannot resell dimensional lumber as dimensional lumber, which I thought was very interesting. And granted, a lot of the lumber that comes out of pre-existing homes, if they're deconstructed, is of higher quality than what you can get today. But I also don't think that, but if you're just going to be building a new house with new dimensional lumber and then taking that old dimensional lumber and turning it into a custom coffee table, I mean, is that the highest and best use? And I thought maybe Quest might have some insight into, I mean, part of it probably just has to do with the amount of what are we going to call it? Used dimensional lumber. But so I'm putting that out there.
And Susan, to clarify your question, it's not that it's illegal to do it, it's just that it's not being done in the marketplace because of.
I think it might be illegal to do it because
Okay.
all lumber that is sold is graded, right? So who's going to come back in behind and grade that lumber? I don't know. I just think it's it'll be an emerging challenge as deconstruction takes off.
And then
That's a
Tara has a
great-
comment, but Quest, can you take a crack at that too?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We in Seattle have been fortunate to be able to get our inspectors to inspect projects that we have built ourselves, and then our sister companies, other developers have built with reused lumber, reclaimed and salvaged lumber. Completely correct assessment that the older lumber is much stronger. It's all those things that we would want. And then Seattle actually took the bull by the horns, and they have added into their code the ability, if it's used within Seattle from an existing structure, it's assumed to be graded lumber and structurally sound. And so that's a municipal thing, and making sure that we rally our legislators, municipal people, our council members to add those things into the code, or other people within other municipal organizations. Like in Seattle, we have Seattle Department of Construction, other organizations that push those policy changes to make it useful, make the material useful beyond just furniture.
Great. There's a ton of answers in the chat, and I had to just do a little call out to the Pacific Northwest. We are doing great, guys. Okay, Reed, and then Gavin.
Hi, I'm Reed Lipset at the Center for Industrial Ecology at Yale. And I'm interested in turning the question a little bit back towards the climate change dimension of this. I led a review of policies related to circularity for both buildings and cars for the International Resource Panel. And I was very struck by the complete absence of evaluation of the effectiveness of policy. So there's lots of policy that gets put in place and no one ever goes back and says, okay, what did we get out of this? Did we get a lot of greenhouse gas reduction or a little bit? There's kind of an assumption that, if it's circular, it's green and all of the above, and it's wonderful. And the quantitative modeling that was done in that report showed a dramatic difference in the likely impact on greenhouse gas emissions of different strategies. So it was not a report that said, let's just do all of the above.
Cool. We're going to do a future forum just on policy, but Sarah, have you all done any studies where you've actually looked at effectiveness of policies?
I don't think so. I think I mean, even in the European Commission, some of the strategy stuff is still relatively new. So yeah, we haven't done any kind of deep dives on evaluation.
Yeah, Reed, really good point. Any policy, by the way, we're passing. Anyone else have a comment on that, or should we? Really good comment.
I put the link to that study in the chat.
Great. Okay, cool.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Gavin.
Yeah, so my name is Gavin, and I'm also a Minnesota Green Corps member, and I work for the city of Rochester, Minnesota. And I have a kind of I guess, loaded question in a way, and it's not really aimed towards anyone in particular. I'm just like genuinely curious about things that I can do like to serve my community, and I guess try to like provide some insights on some current issues that we are facing. And one of them is definitely historic preservation. We actually have like our own board that kind of like goes through like the kind of buildings that we should preserve, especially in the downtown area. And just for some context, our biggest industry is Mayo Clinic. And if you're not aware, Mayo Clinic is trying to expand their campus a lot. And we also have an initiative in Rochester called Destination Medical Center. And they've been doing just a lot on the reconstructing of our buildings, constructing new buildings, reconstructing our streets. And there's just a lot of demolition, lots of new construction happening. And one of the things that is concerning to me is how can we potentially balance the growing industry of Mayo Clinic, trying to expand their campus while also trying to preserve some of our older, more like historic type of districts that are immediately located adjacent to this growing entity in our city. Like there's this one block that council is considering to make a part of the National Register of Historic Places, but that hasn't really like gone anywhere, especially since Mayo Clinic has kind of like this huge foothold on our city. And I'm just kind of curious, like,
I think we got the gist of your question. Okay, yeah. Heidi, you want to take this one?
Sure, I can do this one. So Rochester is a really interesting town to do historic preservation in because of the hold that, I mean, the Mayo Clinic is, you know, from their perspective is Rochester. So I would say, as someone who's done a lot of policy advocacy, the way forward is to make good friends with the Mayo Clinic. You can't fight the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, right? That's not going to happen. Is to find the way that, like, figure out what it is that they need and help them get there, right? I think too often we go in with this idea, especially as historic preservationists, that I'm going to fight you, I'm going to make you not do this, when really what they just need is a path for figuring out what is it that they need from buildings. And do we have buildings that are already existing that we can show them will cost much less money to use to achieve those ends, right? I think not going in with the idea that you're going to fight them, but you are there to help them to figure it out. And I think that's how, that's how people should go forward in trying to work with elected officials and cities and big businesses, is how do I help you? Also know that, like, for me as a historic preservationist, I'm looking 5 years out. That means, like, there are buildings that are on the chopping block that are I'm going to lose because I just got to Minnesota last year. And so, like, if we haven't been involved with something for some time, like if the things that are like possibly going to be knocked down right away, that will probably happen. And to be ready for that, it's also educating that even if it's on the National Register, you can tear it down. That doesn't protect anything. And so I think there's a lot of, again, misperception of what historic preservation does and what, like, these national listings and local listings do. But I think it's mostly about first making friends and providing them assistance instead of telling them that they can't do something they want, because you'll lose.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna go ahead and get to ask my questions now until other people raise their hand, and then we do have a question for you, Reed, in a moment. So Sarah, I was particularly intrigued by your graph where you had the different sort of trajectories going, and then you mentioned I wanted to get clarity in this because it was a little unclear to me. Timber, well, you had plastic and paper, and you had timber and, can't read my writing, trading off. So what did you mean by plastic and paper trading off?
Well, paper trading off for some of the plastic use in, I mean, that's more broadly because we were looking at kind of 4 main industries, and that was the industries were like, obviously concrete, steel, aluminium, and plastic. So it was just about, the point was, I think, is just looking at where you can switch for alternatives.
So what's an example of plastic and paper trading off, for example?
I mean, not so much applicable
In
to the
construction, I mean.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, the fact was that report looked at just for industries. It wasn't, the plastic element wasn't just focused on the construction sector. So that was just the plastics industry as a whole. So maybe a little bit deceiving there. So I apologize for that.
Okay, good, good. And then I did have another question for you. In terms of toxic chemicals, so it looks like most of your focus was sort of on greenhouse gas. Did you do any work on looking at the toxic chemicals in the different materials and how that might play into it?
No, unfortunately, it was very much focused on the greenhouse gas emissions and climate change.
Okay, cool. Heidi, I live in a historic home, so I totally get this. And I have windows that we have debated what to do about our windows. So this is very funny because we have the windows with all the little, all the perturbations, which are so cool. The question I have though is, what are you all doing to work on the critical issue that so many of the big cities, all cities have right now, of trying to increase density, and how you're trying to integrate density with historic preservation? What are you all doing about that?
So I would say that there are some interesting things that have been done. I'm not sure at this point, a lot of the work that we do specifically is our historic rehab loan program. That is a loan for developers using the tax credit. It gives them access to the entire tax credit, delays their tax liability so they can do more work. So that really helps with a lot of the conversion of commercial like offices to residential to help increase density. So we are working with, so for instance, we're talking with the Downtown Alliance here in St. Paul. They're trying to increase the population in downtown St. Paul from 10,000 to 30,000. And so we're talking with them about ways that we can do educational pieces for developers who may have some Class C office space that's not very attractive and not being used. And so we can help them to envision how we could help, how they could adapt that into housing. I think there are we've done a lot of those types of projects through our historic rehab loans. I think we've converted almost anything you can think of into housing at this point. And so we are working with local organizations to do more outreach to developers who haven't done that yet in order to get them there. There are also a lot of organizations that I have talked to around the country who are working with folks who have a very large parcel on which there's a single family home, and making adjustments to ordinances that would allow additional buildings to split parcels, and to be able to do this in historic districts, so that in ways that it is not the street view. There are a lot of ways you can adapt the use of a parcel where you have, say, a very large house, but on an even larger parcel. So there are a lot of great examples out there in historic preservation with ways to increase density on that way too, not just in multifamily, but in single family also.
Great, cool. Gretchen, in that forum that you went to and that was associated with Troy a couple of days ago, can you tell us what some of the top, you said there were 23 or so policies, what were like the top 3 that kind of rose to like maybe people would move forward on them more quickly?
A lot. Well, I'm looking at my list right now so I can come up with it. There was a lot around the actual materials recovery and reuse. And so this gets back to some of the questions earlier, like what does it take in a local government or a state government so that you can reuse ungraded or graded lumber structurally, which most building codes do not currently permit. What other ways can you reuse the material beyond structural? And there are a lot of pieces of a building that are not structural that you can still use these materials really to their highest and best use. And so really talking about that, this was very much focused at a state level rather than local policy. And you know, as I touched on, it's really the local policy that is going to be most effective. But from a state perspective, what could New York do in terms of asbestos abatement, which is a big issue for any house, whether it's being demolished or deconstructed? How do we abate the hazardous materials? So what could the state do at that level to make deconstruction an easier, safer, which it already is a safer route than demolition? So that kind of information. Looking at what kind of policy what kind of levers can shift a small town or a large city in terms of permitting processes. So if you are taking down a building in order to build a new building, then perhaps if you're agreeing to deconstruct the building, your permit gets awarded sooner. So that kind of information. It was really wide ranging, 21 topics, but people dove in and were really eager to see, the summary that came out of it. It was just yesterday. So, compiling all that information.
Great, thank you. So Reed, I think we're going to have you come. Your name had been tossed around as someone to be a future speaker. So I think we will ask you to come at a future forum and actually present on some of your work because it sounds really interesting. So I have one last question for all the panelists, our closing question, and you can give either a brief or a more extensive answer if you wish. What, in your opinion, is the biggest barrier from kind of your perspective and your work? What is the biggest barrier to moving forward? And if you could also tie that into climate change, that would be great, climate change goals. Let's see, Heidi, would you like to go first?
Sure, I can go first. So I will say that I think from the historic preservation perspective, our biggest challenge is that people don't know what we do. Is that people still think that historic preservation is tied to preserving big houses and really just preservation for preservation's sake. And so what happens then is that we get excluded from conversations, and then we are not able to actually fully do the work that we know we can do. So we can't educate people in the ways that they could reuse buildings, and also the flexibility of our perspective and our framework. So if I could get people to just take that idea of historic preservation and throw it out the window and think that historic preservation is basically, please don't throw your building away, that would be a huge win. I have this conversation all the time with folks about what it is that we do as historic preservationists. So that's definitely our biggest obstacle to get at the table. I think we're not even fully at the table yet.
Cool. And then Gretchen, there's a question that's come in for you. So if you can give your answer to this bigger question, but also, does your state, this is from Reed, does your state regulate asbestos in single family homes? In Iowa, homeowners are allowed to do their own work, which can oppose some concerns for reclaiming material at that level. So in New York, are you regulating asbestos in the single family homes already?
That's a really good question. And unfortunately, that's not my area of expertise. There was a lot of discussion around it yesterday, so I'll get back to Reed about that once we get all of that information together. In terms of obstacles for deconstruction in the circular building economy, time and cost to deconstruct rather than to demolish in markets that don't yet do that is a challenge. Those are challenges that can be easily overcome, in fact, through permitting and through incentives. The larger challenge that people face, that we face, is actually finding the facilities to store and process and remarket those materials. So yesterday, one of the stats that was quoted was that a 2,400 square foot home, which is taken down, creates 135,000 pounds of material. That is an enormous amount. And so we need warehousing facilities to be able to take the material to process it, to put it back into the market again. New York State, there are some ideas in New York State on identifying those sites. And obviously we don't want to build new. We want to use existing sites that right now are vacant or under capacity. So that to me is one of our largest challenges.
Great, thank you. And then Sarah, what would you say is the biggest barrier from your perspective?
I mean, I think there's so much to do across the whole supply chain, and I think not, to some extent we need to get better at using some of the tools that might be available to us. So definitely looking at how we procure for circularity and reuse in the construction of new buildings, and how we build in to the fabric of the kind of design and value chain process some of the key requirements that we need to build in, as as architects do their work, as clients develop contracts for contractors, as contractors put that through the supply chain, that there's this cascade, effectively a circular economy and reuse metrics and measures that are in there, so that we really do get, you know, second use of materials built into the construction of new buildings.
Great, thank you. So can we give all of our three presenters a warm thank you and clapping with your reactions? And then I will turn it back to Mary Ann to talk about the next forum. Mary Ann, you're on mute.
Yep. As well as learning experience for me, as I'm sure for everybody on the call. I want to thank you as well for participating. Our next forum, we are trying to do these every one a quarter. And the next one is a little bit past a quarter from now, but it will be held on April 11th. At 2 p.m. So we ask, that's 2 p.m. Eastern time. We ask you to pencil that in. The topic will be measuring the economic impacts of reuse. And I also, if you didn't see it in the chat, the presentations from today, as well as the recording, will be posted on NERC's website tomorrow. And I'll also be emailing you with that link so that you can access those at a later time. But thank you all for attending. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.